Debating Championships 2007. And I invite you to welcome the teams in the semi-finals. In first proposition, Oxford C. In first opposition, St.Andrews A. In second proposition, Sydney G. And in second opposition, Oxford D. I invite you please to welcome the panellists sitting with me today, Hayley Nix, Joe Nen, Derek Land, Jeremy Fryer, Neil Harvey-Smith and Peter Nielsen. And on the motion, this House would ban websites that glorify eating disorders. I call on the first speaker in proposition to propose the motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be debating before you. The motion before the House today is this House would ban websites that glorify eating disorders. Here's how we're defining it. First of all, we're going to say that Western liberal democracies should be passing a law that ban websites glorifying eating disorders. Here's what we mean by glorifying eating disorders. First, we mean websites that directly encourage eating disorders by telling people how to develop disorders. For example, how to induce vomiting in order to become a bulimic, what diet pills to take in order to become an anorexic, or how to maintain a body mass index that physicians regard as anorexic. This varies from country to country. We'll just say that we'll have these liberal democracies use physicians to help them pass a law deciding what body mass index is acceptable. And we're also going to say that websites that praise someone's physical attractiveness on the same website as they mention that person's eating disorder is also not permissible. Here's how we're going to enforce it. We believe that we should have set up committees, just like the types of committees that we have, to determine what constitutes child pornography. We believe that this is already done and that you can have similar committees. Moreover, if there's any ambiguity, we're A-OK with the parties involved litigating and allowing the courts to decide whether the spirit and the text of the law is followed. We believe that this is a good plan for three reasons. The first thing that we're going to talk about is fairly self-evident, but we're going to get through quickly and make the point. That's the idea that eating disorders are harmful. The second thing that we're going to discuss is that the state has the right to limit the dissemination of harmful content. And the final thing we're going to talk about is the nature of eating disorders and how they're particularly influenced by the dissemination and glorification on websites. So the first thing is the idea that eating disorders are harmful. I'm sure that we've all heard the pretty horrifying statistics that roughly 1 in 10 adolescent girls in many countries, such as Britain and the United States, develop eating disorders. That these destroy people's lives. Do you really challenge the idea that, go for it, James?
Why is it legitimate for people to continue to advocate eating disorders in public via other media, but just not via the internet?
We're not necessarily saying that it's okay to do it in other media, right? Like, we're talking about this specific motion. Just because we don't cover every possible, like, just because I think that maybe I want to develop an eating disorder and that's legal, doesn't mean that we should not illegalize it in this particular instance, right? So 1 in 10 adolescent females tend to develop eating disorders in Western liberal democracies. It destroys people's lives. It has a high mortality rate. When someone becomes a bulimic, the acid in their stomach helps dissolve their esophagus. These are terrible things that happen to people. But more importantly, it has persistent effects on their lives. Once they develop an eating disorder, it's almost like an addiction. It's a problem that's likely to last them well beyond their adolescence and well into their adulthood. Any society that really cares about its citizens will do everything in its power to discourage people from falling victim to these terrible disorders. The second general point that we'd like to talk about is that the state has the right to limit the dissemination of harmful content. And I think that we can look to numerous other examples to see that there's a clear precedent for this. For example, several countries disallow the inciting of terrorist violence or racial violence. Several countries disallow people to put on websites information that teaches them how to commit suicide. For example, what sort of stuff they should inject, or what chemicals they should ingest in order to kill themselves. We also disallow websites that glorify the killing of abortion doctors, for example. This was a case in the United States where they had a bunch of pictures of abortion doctors in the United States, and every time one of them was killed, they would put a big red X through the picture. Now, this wasn't saying, these are abortion doctors and you should kill them, but it sent a clear message that that website was encouraging people to kill abortion doctors, and that was not a good thing. So clearly, in these sorts of countries, there is a precedent set for this. The second idea under this general point is that free speech isn't absolute, and I'm sure you've all heard this argument before. We limit free speech when there's a likelihood that people will be harmed by it. For example, shouting fire in a crowded theater, or defamation cases. I dare say that someone's reputation is less important than another person's life, another person's ability to be free from eating disorders, yet we still pass laws disallowing defamation. The final idea under this independent point is that the state also protects people from self-harm. Many liberal democracies disallow fighting words, not necessarily because they'll induce a fight, but because we don't want the people themselves, who are the ones creating the fight, to get hurt by it. We don't want fighting words because they're inherently likely to induce violence, and they're inherently likely to lead to the person speaking the fighting words to cause violence against themselves. And that's the problem. So we do protect people from speaking words that create self-harm. Now let's draw the nexus to eating disorders and the dissemination of information on websites in our third point, which is the nature of eating disorders. What we would say, first of all, is that eating disorders are socially induced. And this is why it's incredibly important. Right now, adolescents especially go on the web. This is where they spend a disproportionate amount of their time. Eating disorders were not that common 30 years ago. So what conclusion can we draw from this? The conclusion that we can draw is that there's something in society. There's something about how other people behave, what preferences other people have that lead to these eating disorders. We feel that when adolescents spend so much of their time on the internet, and when eating disorders are socially induced by other people's behaviors and by the message that the rest of society sends, then it's very likely that these websites are going to have a disproportionate impact on adolescents especially. We believe that eating disorders are created by distorted self-perceptions based on social norms. And that is the real problem here. Ultimately, what happens is that eating disorders prey on the most vulnerable people in society, and then it sticks with them for the rest of their lives. We do not believe that when adolescents are going on the internet, not necessarily with any sort of supervision, that they're the ones who are going to be hurt the most. And therefore, they're the ones we need to protect the most. So, what have we talked about today? We discussed how eating disorders are harmful. We've talked about how the state has the right to limit the dissemination of harmful content. And finally, we've talked about how eating disorders are socially induced and how the internet is an important medium to try to fight them. For all these reasons, we're proud to propose.